Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Brittany Branyan, and I serve as Director of Carey Center Collegiate and Community Programs to include the nonprofit affiliate program, currently serving now over 125 nonprofits in East Alabama and beyond. Welcome to the fourth installment of the Carey Center Summer Fundraising Series, Applying the KISS Principles to Grant Writing. Before we begin, I would like to share a little bit more about our program for those of you who are unfamiliar. The Carey Center Nonprofit Affiliate Program fosters a community of educators, professionals, and organizations and students who have a desire to embody philanthropy, nonprofit studies, and leadership in their professional and personal lives. We provide professional development and networking opportunities to members to include Mix and Mingles, the Carey Center Volunteer Internship and Career Fair, Meet Me at the Vic, and the Carey Center Nonprofit Summit. In addition to these events, now more than ever, we are focusing on professional development and learning opportunities to include our summer fundraising series and the Nonprofit Affiliate Book Club. Carey Center Nonprofit Affiliates are the first to learn of upcoming programming, and membership is free. I will include information on how to join the nonprofit affiliate program and would be delighted to have the pleasure of working with you, especially as we navigate this challenging time. Now, let's get to the reason you're all here. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker. Noemí Oeding is currently a PhD student and graduate research assistant at Auburn University in the Department of Political Science. Her research interests revolve around nonprofits, especially in the arts, and American politics, and the intersection between these. Prior to pursuing her PhD, Noemí worked for various nonprofit organizations, most notably as the executive director of the Montgomery Music Project in Montgomery, Alabama. She has hands-on experience in nonprofit management, leadership and governance, fundraising and grant writing, and volunteer and event management. Noemí has successfully secured funding from the Alabama State Council on the Arts, the Florida State Arts Council, the Alabama State Department of Education, and various private foundations. She also has experience as a grant reader, including serving on the Music Grant Review panel for the Alabama State Council on the Arts in 2017. She is a member of the Association for Research on Nonprofit Organizations and Voluntary Action, ARNOVA, and the International Society for Third Sector Research, ISTR. Noemí holds a master's in arts administration from Florida State University and a bachelor's in voice performance from the University of Florida. In addition to her studies, Noemí is a freelance grant writer. She and her husband have 2 small children and reside in East Alabama. We are thankful she took the time to join us today and share her knowledge and passion for fundraising in the area of grant writing. Without any further delay, please welcome Noemí.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And just a little note that there are 2 small children in my home, so if you hear anything, it's them. So as Brittany said, I think I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. My path to being a fundraising researcher was, there we go, was a little bit winding. I started my life as an opera singer, actually, and then ended up teaching in the public school system. And as we all know, the public schools are chronically underfunded. So I started doing some grant writing with no experience or knowledge of best practices, and landed a few and had some people ask me, how do you do that? And that led me to my master's degree in arts administration, which is nonprofit management in the arts. And then that led me to my current place here. Political science is where the public administration and public policy degree is housed, and under that is the concentration of nonprofits. It's circuitous, as is my whole career, so it fits. And one of the things that I've done most recently that has really helped me in cementing my understanding of grant writing is serving on grant panels for the Junior League of Lee County and also for the Alabama State Council on the Arts. Those have been very helpful in confirming from the other side of the table that these principles work. And I'm sure most of you know KISS is keep it simple, stupid. Don't call yourself stupid, but do keep it simple. With grant writing, it's very important to be direct, to be forthcoming, and to be clear, because you need to make your case quickly so that your grant readers can determine whether or not they're willing and able to fund you. Oh, that's not, how do we do this? There we go. All right, so the first thing I want to address is your organization ready for grant writing? Oftentimes people think that grant writing is that magic bullet that's going to keep them from shutting their doors, or that thing that's going to make sure that they can do that project that they've been wanting to do, and that's not the case. You have to be prepared, and you have to already have a fundraising strategy in place that includes private donations, that includes any sort of sales kind of things that you do for your organization, in addition to the grant writing. So the grant writing is the third piece of the puzzle, but it really does need to be in there after your other pieces are in place, as does all of these things that you see on this slide. Your 501c3 status, you must have your 501c3 status secured. And for the most part, you want to have had that for at least 2 years before granting organizations will consider your grant application. Some of them will even say that, some will say 5 years, so you really need to read the request for proposal as far as that's concerned, but you really do need a 501c3 status. If you don't have that, you might be working with someone under their 501c3 status, that's fine, but know that most of that kind of work only takes place for about a year, and then you need to be able to move on into your own 501c3. You need to have a mission statement, and it needs to be clear and concise. If you cannot say your mission statement like that, if everyone in your organization, whether it's another employee, your board, key volunteers, people who take advantages of your services, if they can't say your mission statement with no prompting, without having to look it up, you need to revise your mission statement. Because if it's too long, if it's too convoluted, then that's not going to be something that's going to be a successful mission statement. You need to have a plan for your project or your program that you're wanting to get funded. It can't just be this nebulous idea. Funders don't grant ideas. They support concrete, actionable steps. So you need to make sure that you know what that is. Your financial house needs to be in order. If your books are a mess, if you are, like I said, in danger of closing because you don't have enough funding, this is not where you need to be spending your time. You need to get yourself organized and prepared. Do you have the capacity? And I think this one is really important. You need to make sure that you have the staff in place, including the expertise that you need. You need to make sure that you have the facilities, and you need to make sure that you have the time to be writing grants, to be writing follow-up reports, to be doing all of the things that are involved in grant writing. Grant writing is long, it's tedious, it's time-consuming, and if you don't have the time for that, then now is not the time to be writing grants. That leads us to, is it worth the effort? If you're going to write a 300-page grant and then all you're going to get is $500, that might not be the best use of your time. Or even if you're going to get a $1,000 grant, but it took up time that you could have been spending meeting with individual donors, and you're at a point in your organization's history where you're needing money right now, then your time is better spent meeting those individual donors rather than writing that grant. At the same time, when you're making that calculation on if it's worth the effort, you need to consider the prestige that comes with receiving a grant. Oftentimes, especially with federal grants, the prestige of getting to say, we have been funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, or the NHI, or whatever it is that's your big federal thing, or even local organizations. We've been funded by the Community Foundation of, name your area. That can help other individual donors and other grant sponsors consider your organization as being worthy of receiving funds. So do calculate that into your calculations about whether it's worth the effort. And then finally, this is the big one. Have you done your market research? Of course, market is in quotation marks because we're nonprofits, but have you identified the need? Is there an actual need for the service that you're wanting to provide? Have you identified your objective, the solution that you're going to provide for that need that you've identified? Who are you impacting? Be specific, get demographic information, get a breakdown of who takes advantage of the services that you provide, and be prepared to have that information. Figure out the logistics. Where and when are you going to do this project that you're trying to get a grant for? What expertise does your organization provide? Are you the best at doing this? Are you the only one doing this? Be prepared to talk about that as well. How much money do you need? What are you going to use that money for? And where are you going to get that money from? The majority of grants require matching funds, and those matching funds can be from finances that you already have in your system. They can be from other individual donors who are willing to match a grant, or from other grants if you already have the understanding that you're going to be receiving that grant money. But you need to know that in order to be prepared to write your grant. So let's say you have all those things met. Remember that on average, 70% of funds from nonprofit organizations come from individual donors. And so if you got that money secured from your individual donors and you're ready to start grant writing, then you're ready. And if you're not, then go back and start your individual donor campaign first. All right, so identifying grant sources. This is one of the trickiest things, especially if you are taking over for someone, you've never done grant writing before, or you're just looking to expand your grant writing program. Candid.org, about a year ago, GuideStar and the Foundation Center combined into Candid.org. If you go to the website, which is linked here, you'll get this PowerPoint at the end, and so I put these links and hopefully it goes through, but Candid.org is their website. And if you go there, you can find the foundation directory. That the minimum you can pay for that is $3.99 a year. So it's a little bit pricey. So that goes back into your, is it worth it calculation? Is it worth paying $3.99 a year to identify some foundations that you might reach out to? They also have requests for proposals listed there, so that might be something to look at. And they have GuideStar, and GuideStar has a free option and a paid option. And with the free option, you can generally look at the 990s, which is the form that all organizations submit to the government. It's their tax forms. And that'll tell you who they're giving money to, what they're spending their money on. It's a very good thing if you can pick through it to see what granting sources might be funding something that you're doing. Grants.gov is the site to find federal funds, and that's a great resource if you're looking again for requests for proposals. Michigan State University has a clearinghouse under the Grants for Nonprofit directory that lists different grant sources. Some of that is available to the public, some of that is only for Michigan State University entities, but it is a good site to kind of pick through. Of course, your previous grant sources are great sources for actually reapplying to grant funding from them, and also reach out to them and say, hey, who else would you recommend that our our program reach out to? Because their program officer probably knows other program officers and might say, you know, this really matches these organizations' goals. And so don't be afraid to reach out to those people. Here's my little trick. Find similar nonprofits either in your area or nationally that either do something similar or that are located in your geographic area, and see who's funding them. And there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes you might apply to that same granting source. Sometimes it might jog your memory and say, oh, yes, I should look at contacting my local blah, blah, blah organization to see if they have a similar grant program. So do take the time to do the research on other nonprofits and see what they are getting funded from to see how you might get funded. A big source of funding that is local is your local community, family, and private foundations. They are often housed in one community foundation for individuals to give through, or they might all work with that community foundation. But find out who's in your area and find out what they fund. You know, we're in East Alabama and the Jason Duffner Foundation is big in this area, but they're not going to fund my little organization because they have their things that they're doing. So keep that in mind. Don't waste your time applying for something if it's not fitting your area's interests. And then reach out to your board and to your key volunteers. When I was working for the Montgomery Music Project, one of my board members was a pediatric doctor and a pediatric surgeon. So he worked at Baptist. And he came to me one day, he said, Noemí, I really want to help. What can I do to help you? And I said, you know, I'm looking for more grant sources that I could apply to that could help us fund some of our programming. And he said, well, let me ask. So he went and he asked the Baptist Foundation, and he got us a one-on-one meeting with the head of the Baptist Foundation to talk about potential grant sources. And we weren't a good fit for their overall grant program, but their program officer said, you know, I can give you $1,000 to help fund this part of that program. And so it wasn't an astronomical amount, but it helped me start a program that I wanted to get started. And then I could go to my other grant sources and say, Baptist Health helped fund this. Will you match that funding? My biggest caution to you here is don't chase the money. Oftentimes we see a request for proposal and it sounds cool and maybe something we could do, or the money looks really great and you think, gosh, maybe we should just go ahead and apply for it. But if it doesn't fit your organization's mission, it's not worth your time or your effort. If you waste your time and don't get the funding, then you've wasted your time. And if you do happen to get your funding and now you have to create a whole new program that isn't matching what you actually want to be doing, then you're going to be hitting your head against the wall trying to meet the requirements of this grant that don't necessarily meet what you're trying to do. So do keep that in mind. Don't chase the money. Make sure that the mission of your organization matches the things that the sponsor is funding. Do your homework. Research the sponsor. Make sure that you check out their website, read the requirements for the grant, either through the RFP or the actual grant application. Read it again, highlight, underline, whatever it is you need to do to make sure that when you're ready to write that application, that you fill every part of that requirement. Pay attention to timelines. If it's unclear what the timelines are, feel free to contact that grant sponsor and find out, when are things due? When are the reports due? Find out every detail about the timeline for that project and think about how that fits in with your organization's timeline. If a grant is due the same day as your fiscal year end, that may not be the year to fill out that timeline or that grant application. Make sure you know their funding priorities. If they're funding X, Y, and Z, are you X, Y, and Z? And also, if you're Z, do they have Z listed just because they have a pet project? This happens a lot for me in the arts, especially big grant organizations. They will often put that they fund human social services and they fund nursing practices and they fund the arts. And then if you do a little digging, you find out they fund the arts because one of the people on the board has a little pet project in the arts. And so that's what they're funding. And so I know, hey, not going to waste my time on that one. And then also look at their average grant size and the number of grants. And that's where the 990 can be helpful. You can go in there and see, who are they giving money to? How much are they giving to? And how many? Are they giving $10,000 to one organization? Is it a different organization each year, or is it the same organization? Those things are really important, because if it's the same organization, then it's obvious that they've got some kind of deal worked out. And so this is not worth your time. If it's a $500 grant to 20 organizations, then you have to consider, is a $500 grant worth your time? So keep that in mind. Let's go to the next column, the research previous grantees. You want to look at patterns. Are they funding large organizations exclusively? Are they funding a mix of organizations? Are they saying that they're funding health and human services and the arts, but they're only funding one or the other? Keep that in mind. Allowed and not allowed activities. Very often grant organizations say they won't fund a fundraiser, they won't fund salaries, they won't fund operating expenses. So if you need operating expenses, you don't need to be going to that grant organization. If you're looking for funding to help put on a big gala to help support your organization, you don't need to be going to those organizations. But then also sometimes by looking at their previous guarantees, they may say they don't sponsor a gala, but then they did. So that might be something to call their sponsor, their program officer, and say, hey, what happened there? Maybe there's a special deal that happened, or maybe it's something that they're like, well, you know. The average grant size, again, you can look on the 990s. You can also see oftentimes they'll list them on their websites. And then are there surprises? Are there the outlier organization that got funded? Why? Why would that be? That's something where then you can contact a program officer and ask them, who's reviewing grants? Find out who the grant panel is. They might just tell you something generic like it's professionals in the field. They might tell you it's our board members. They might tell you it's just me. So keep that in mind, that that's something you can ask. You can also ask them what distinguishes a successful grant from unsuccessful ones in your grant process. And actually the Alabama State Council of the Arts, that is one of the questions they ask you when you fill out your grant application is, have you been in touch with the program officer? They want you to talk to the program officer. And when you call that program officer, and when you call them, you got to call them early and you got to call them often because they're busy. But when you call that program officer and you talk to them, you build a relationship with them, And you can find out information and details that could help your grant application become stronger. Oftentimes, program officers are willing to read your grant application if you give it to them early enough. And they'll give you, they won't tell you, yes, we'll fund this, no, we won't fund this, but they may say, hey, this is really similar to something we funded, yay, or this is really similar to something we're funded, can you do something different? So talk to your program officers, that's what they're there for, and they want to be a resource for you. Good grant writing is good storytelling. If you're not telling a compelling story, then they're not going to want to read it. And that story also needs to be backed up with facts, statistics, and quotes as appropriate. Don't get into some narrative that's all fluffy and blah, 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 and get off lost in the woods, but make sure that you are telling a story that really speaks to the grant reader. This is later in my slides, but on average, your grant reviewer will spend about 30 minutes reviewing your grant that you spent about 30 hours working on. And the reason is that they're often reading so many grant applications and they have a deadline because they have a meeting that they have to go to. Most of the time, grants are being reviewed by people who have a full-time job and are doing this as a volunteer on the side. And so they don't have the time to dedicate 30 hours to each grant application. So you need to make sure that your story is compelling and that it's something that people are going to want to listen to and read and catches their attention so that they keep reading. So here's how you set yourself up for success with grant writing. First, start early. Like I said, with a program officer, you can reach out to them a month before the grant is due, and they'll often have time to actually read your entire grant application and give you feedback on all of it. Or if you just have your narrative, or if you just have your budget, whatever you have prepared, if you reach out to them early, they'll read it for you and give you feedback. If you're reaching out the week it's due, the day it's due, that ain't gonna happen. At the same time, if you start early, you'll know, oh, we really need to get this information, or I need that information, or I need to pull this person in. Make sure that you're meeting all deadlines. And by meeting a deadline, I don't mean, gosh, it's due at 6 o'clock. Phew, 5:59, I got it done. Give yourself a deadline of at least 2 days before the grant is due. At the very least, noon of the day it's due, to give yourself time where it's like, oh my gosh, it's not uploading. I'm calling the program officer, but they're busy with everybody else who's having problems uploading it. Give yourself time. Make sure that you are getting there early on your grant applications. And then what I often do is I'll set myself, if it's due on the 15th, I'm making it due on the 13th since that was Monday. And then what I'm doing is I'm building my timeline backwards from that of when I'm going to make sure that I have my narrative done and my budget done and things like that. Outline your proposal before you write. And the reason I recommend this is that you want to make sure that what you're writing flows and that what you are suggesting makes sense logically throughout your document. So if your budget says this, but your narrative says that, and your abstract says something else, I'm going to be confused with what you're trying to do. It doesn't have to be like a huge difference, but if your budget says you need $10,000 for this, but then your narrative says you need $12,000 because somewhere along the line that number changed, which it often does, then I'm going to be like, wait, what? Where's that extra $2,000? So make sure that your proposal makes sense by outlining it all the way through. Right, with passion and confidence. The reason you're working at the nonprofit you're working at is because you're passionate about what that organization is doing, I hope. So make sure that that comes across in what you're writing. Be careful of sounding arrogant, however. Make sure that it's clear that you're passionate, but that you're not talking down to the people that you're writing to. Maintain coherence across the application. Like I said, that's why you outline it. Write plainly, avoid jargon, and define all acronyms upon first use. Do not assume that anyone knows anything. I actually once saw a paper that somebody wrote for publication, and the reviewer wrote, what does US mean? They wanted somebody to spell out United States. So be sure that every acronym is spelled out. Be sure that you don't use jargony stuff, but know your field. So for the Arts Council, I'm going to assume that everybody reading that document in the music category has at least some background in music and is capable of understanding when I talk about orchestral strings, or that I'm talking about the Verbato or the series of books that I use for my students. Use proper grammar, proofread, and check your spelling. Dot your T's and cross your I's, and yes, I mean dot your T's and cross your I's. First you dot your I's and cross your T's, and then you cross your T's and dot your T's and cross your I's. Make sure that every little part of the grant application is reflected in your proposal. Make sure that everything that you are supplying to the grant organization is logical, makes sense, and is perfect. And here's why. When I have 100 grant applications to read and you forgot to attach X document, out the window, one less one I have to read. And it stinks, but it happens, and you need to be aware of that. Make sure that you have met every criteria for that grant application, because at the end of the day, there's too many grant applications for the time, there's too many grant applications for the money, and your grant readers are going to start looking for any nitpicky reason to disregard your grant application. Not that they're trying to be mean, but they're just, they have to start making decisions, and one of the easiest ways is to say they didn't meet the needs, so we're not going to review that one. And then finally, make sure that your formatting makes your proposal readable. So use headers, bullets, charts, tables, graphics, whatever works for you. Being aware that sometimes when it's an online application, especially bigger funding organizations will have very standardized, like they all use the same format basically, and they don't have a way to upload charts and graphs within the body. Maybe you can add it as an attachment, but so keep that in mind. That's where you go back to start early and read over the grant application so you know what is and isn't able to be uploaded. Make it easy for your readers to read the proposal. Like I said, they're reviewed in about 30 minutes and they have a lot of proposals to review. You never know if yours is going to be the first one they read or the last one they read or somewhere in the middle when they're like, ugh. So keep that in mind. Make sure that it's short and compelling. That's where KISS comes in. Use as many words as you need to get your point across and no more. Make sure that it's simple, straightforward. Use declarative verbs when you're talking. Use words like identify, establish, develop, design. Avoid flowery speech. Don't get lost in the woods. Come back to what you're trying to say and make sure it's there. And something that I've learned is make sure that what you're trying to do is at the beginning. Oftentimes we want to tell this pretty story and get people involved. This is not a storytelling contest. You're telling a story, but this is not a storytelling contest. Get to the point and then tell your story. You know, when I'm running for the Montgomery Music Project, which works with kids in kindergarten through 8th grade in Montgomery, Alabama, teaching orchestral string lessons that they, regardless of their ability to pay. So I'm going to start my story by saying we give scholarships to 98% of the students in our program. And that's what we're asking you to help fund. And here's why. And then I tell them the story about cute little Jacoby who started in kindergarten, has been with us for 3 years and has really pulled up his grades at school and how thankful his mom is. Here's a quote from his mom, etc. So make sure that you capture your reader quickly so that they know what they're reading for in that narrative. Oftentimes when I'm reviewing a grant application, I read the abstract, I skim the narrative, I look at your budget. And the reason I'm looking at your budget is because I want to see what you're asking for money for, and then I go back and read your narrative. And that way, if your budget doesn't make sense, I can just throw you out. Because if you're asking for ridiculous amounts, if your numbers don't match up, if you're asking for funding for things that we don't fund, then I can just toss your application and I don't have to keep reading it. And then if your budget makes sense and if I see what you're reading, what you're asking for, then I read your narrative to see why it is that you're asking for that. And then when you are writing your grant, keep in mind that they're not necessarily experts in your specific topic, but there may be an expert on your board. So for example, with the music panel for the Arts Council, they do make an effort to make sure that everyone on there, of course, is a musician, but then has different varying experiences. So I'm here with my opera training, and then there's somebody there with choral training, and then there's somebody there who's a composer, and then there's somebody there who is the band instructor at ASU, and then there's somebody who teaches orchestral strings. Oh, hey, I know something about orchestral strings too. And so those people will have more say if it's something that's specific to them, but everyone should have some understanding. So when you're writing, keep in mind that you're writing to people who know something, but maybe not everything, but maybe everything. All right, this is the part that I'm sure you all have been waiting for, the nuts and bolts. And this is first and foremost an overview of the grant writing process. Brittany is planning on doing a little bit more of in-depth training, I believe, this coming fall. So keep that in mind. This is not going to be everything you need to know about grant writing. There are books and websites and all sorts of things that will help you with that as well. But these are things that I have found that will make your grant writing proposals stronger. So And these are general things that you'll see in most grant applications. First, a title. Your title should be clear, accurate, and succinct label for your proposal. Oftentimes with, especially federal grants, there will be a requirement for what needs to be in your title, whether that's a certain number that you need to put in or a certain department you need to identify. And you also, whenever I write a title, I want to make sure it's descriptive. And I want to make sure that if I leave an organization, the next grant writer knows what that grant was for. Because oftentimes, if you are funded, then there's a interim report, there's a final report, somebody asks you 3 years later what that grant was for, and if you have a descriptive title, then you know. And this is especially important if you're doing a project that's multi-year. You want to make sure that you give it either a new name or include fiscal year, blah, blah, blah. So for the Montgomery Music Project, we wrote 2 grant applications to the Arts Council every year. We wrote one for our school year program, and then we wrote one for our summer program. And you bet your bottom dollar I put summer 2016 in that title. So when I came back and was writing the final report, that's all that pops up, not my narrative anymore. It just says final report for grant, blah, 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 summer 2016. And I say, oh yeah, that's what I'm writing for, because I was often writing those reports in summer 2017. And so in order to keep my mind straight, I made sure that I put that information there. I often write my title towards the end because it helps me know what I'm doing, unless it's a continuation. The abstract or summary tells the story of the problem and your proposed solution in a compelling, logical manner. And this should definitely be written last. Your abstract is that one little paragraph, 2, 3, 5 sentences, don't get to 5 sentences, that tells your reader what it is that you're doing and why. And it's a lot easier to write that at the end. If you write it at the beginning, you're going to have to go back and change it a few times as your narrative takes shape. You might want to copy a line from your narrative and put it in your abstract. You might want to use a line that you really love, that you've crafted, that doesn't fit in your narrative, stick it in your abstract. Whatever you want to do, but do keep in mind that it should be short and it should really just hook people with what it is that you're trying to do. And keep in mind that, especially with federal grants, your abstracts can be published. So make sure there is absolutely no jargon in it. Your introduction is a short background on your organization. I think that is goes without saying. Your need statement, this I think is a misnomer. Your need statement is not your need statement. Your need statement is the need that you have identified in your community that your organization is uniquely qualified to meet. And so you need to explain how your proposed project will impact your community, your organization, and the funder. How are they going to see a return on their investment? Not in the traditional business sense of X number of clients or blah, 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 but this is going to make our community better because this is going to improve relations here because. Make sure that you're giving that information and make sure that you're supporting your claims with facts, statistics, and quotes. So your need statement needs to be something that's concrete and that is measurable. If it's some, like I said, funders funders don't fund ideas, they fund actions. And so don't talk about this ephemeral idea, we're going to end hunger. Right. I mean, hunger has been with us since the dawn of man. So what is it that you're actually going to be doing in your community to address that need? Continued, goals and objectives. Okay, so goals and objectives are different things and they have very specific meanings. Goals are kind of big picture idea of what you're hoping to achieve through your proposed project. Again, not end hunger, but perhaps like address food insecurity in elementary age students in our community. Your objectives are the things that you're going to do to achieve those goals. And your objectives should be SMART, and if you don't know this acronym, you should definitely learn it. Specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. That means they end. Now, the project may continue, but your goals should end. So if your goal this year, or your objectives, if your objective this year is to establish a food delivery program for elementary schoolers, your project next year cannot be that exact same thing. It should be, this year we are going to expand on what we did last year and serve 20% more students. 20% needs to be a number that you actually believe that you can achieve. Your measurements need to be clear how you're going to say we served X number of students, and it needs to be something that your organization can actually attain. So the American Cancer Society can actually do a nationwide study on the health habits that people have that contributes to cancer. Your little 3-person shop in East Alabama probably can't do the same thing unless you have a partnership with the American Cancer Society or with the university or something like that. So make sure that it's something that's attainable for your organization. Don't think that because all you can do is say, we're going to give meals to 25 kids, that a granting organization is not going to fund that, especially if what you're asking for makes sense for 25 kids, and the organization you're asking is really vested in the area that those 25 kids live in. And so that's where it should be important to your grant sponsor. If you're asking a national organization for money, but you're talking about serving a very, very small community, they may not be interested. But if you're asking your local junior league, because I'm a member, about funding a project that's going to serve 25 kids, and the junior league says, yes, we can see where this project is going, they may fund you. So keep that in mind. For the most part, I say focus on local organizations, granting organizations, the big organizations like a Lowe's or like the Alabama Power. They are really hard to get funded, especially if you don't already have a history of getting funded. But don't disregard them. They're just your future goal for getting funded. Right now, you're working on your small community foundations and your small organizations that are nearby to you that really are invested in your same community. Your project plan is how your proposed project will be carried out. The who, the what, the where, the when, the why, the how. And it needs to make sense, it needs to be reasonable, and it needs to be achievable by your organization. Your evaluation plan is how you plan to track and analyze your data. Make sure that you're planning to track and analyze your data so that you actually track and then analyze your data. Too often what happens is you just get excited to do the project and nobody keeps track of anything, and then at the end you're making up numbers. And someone who fills out that final grant report, has to affirm that those numbers are true and accurate. So make sure those numbers are true and accurate. And then your timeline, which is how you propose to take out your activities. And do you know if I can switch to my other screen, Brittany?
You should be able to if you...
Can you see this?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So this is called a Gantt chart. If you've never seen one before, this is what it looks like. You may not need this.
Wait, I actually cannot see that one. If you go to...
New share.
Yeah. Yep.
You see now?
No, not yet. Let's see.
Oh, wait. I got it. New share. This one.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, good. So this is called a Gantt chart. This is actually not for a grant. This is for an evaluation, but it's the same idea. You have your list of tasks that you're going to accomplish. You have your breakdown of years. In this case, this is for a 2-year grant program. And so we're breaking it down by quarters and by months. Sometimes you can be by weeks. And then you just put a little color block based on when you're going to do what. This is really great if you have a really convoluted program. It's always good to include your interim and your annual reports there. That is not always necessary. Sometimes, like with the Montgomery Music Project, I would just say that I am starting at the start of the school year and ending at the end of the school year. That could be your timeline. So it just depends on what your organization is proposing to do and how complicated your project is as far as the timeline is going to be matching. Your sustainability plan. This one was confusing to me when I first started grant writing, and I thought they meant like reduce, reuse, and recycle. That's not the case. Your sustainability plan has to do with your organization's plan to continue your project after the funding from this granting organization is done. How are you going to continue your program if you don't get that grant next year? Or if they only fund things for 1 year or 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, whatever it is that they do. And it needs to be achievable and logical. So like I said, you may not be applying to Alabama Power this year. It's a big organization. There's already a lot of big fish going for that money. So if you say, well, this year I'm applying to the Junior League of Lee County, and then next year I'm going to apply to Alabama Power, I'm going to be like, I mean, you can, but if you say, so this year I'm applying to the Junior League. Next year we'll probably apply to the Junior League again, and we're going to also get some individual donors on board with this, and we're going to try and find a corporate sponsor. And then in 5 years, our plan is to apply to Alabama Power. Now that's an actionable sustainability plan that I can get behind. Whether it happens or not is kind of inconsequential in the grant writing process, but it does show me that you understand that you're not going to be able to just jump to a giant donor or sponsor in that way. This is the most important part, your budget and your budget justification. Raise your hand if you hate math. Don't tell my husband, he's a math professor. Your budget is so important. Like I said, when I review grant applications, I read your abstract and I may skim your narrative first, and then I jump to the budget, because if your numbers don't make sense, I'm not going to read it. They have to make sense. They need to be specific and they need to be detailed. If you're saying, I want $10,000, I need to know what you're going to spend those $10,000 on. Are you looking to buy 20 music stands at $9.99 each for X amount of dollars and 16 music books for blah, blah, blah? Tell me what you're doing. If there's a budget justification, even more so, let me know what that, we need music stands because we need these specific music stands because they don't fall apart. We need these specific instruments because they're good quality. Make sure that we know what it is that you're getting, why it is that that thing is the one that you're getting. Sometimes with budget justification is things like, I got 3 quotes and here's the one we're going with and here's why. So make sure you're specific and detailed. Make it easy to read and understand. If you don't know Excel, please learn Excel or some similar program that can do this kind of thing for you, because a spreadsheet with columns and clear numbers is the best way to do this. And I will tell you, sometimes with a grant organization that gives me a Word document that they want their budget on, I still return it in an Excel spreadsheet because it just makes sense. And with Excel, if you really learn it, and you don't need to take a course, you just find some tutorials on a website or find somebody who knows how to use it. What you can do is you can actually have it do the calculations for you. You can set up a formula in Excel to make sure that if you add something in column C, it adds column C all the way down so that you don't have arithmetic mistakes, which is that last one. Confirm that your calculations are correct. And I would do it on paper and I would do it on the computer. Double, triple check, have somebody else look over your numbers, make sure that it makes sense. And then know that what your grant organization will and will not fund, what the matching fund requirements are, et cetera, et cetera. So oftentimes grant organizations will not fund salaries, will not fund operating budget expenses, will not fund travel. Know what those things are, know if that can still be used as a matching fund. So we're going to, when I worked at the museum, we are going to put on this exhibit. And so we need money for shipping for the exhibit. We need money for painting the walls of the museum to hang this art beautifully. We need money for docents. And we're going to match that with salaries from our employees because, because they allowed it. Actually, what I ended up doing at the museum was telling them, don't use salary from your employees, because the granting source would allow it, but then the university would get involved and they wanted a cut of this and the benefits had to be included in overhead and it got so confusing. So I said, hey, there's so many other things we can use for matching funds. Let's use those instead. So make sure that what you're using makes sense for the grant you're writing, for the organization you're working with, and make sure that those numbers all square up. And then supporting materials, sometimes grants let you upload additional materials, and that is often things like bios for your key personnel, any awards and recognitions for your program, any other details, charts, graphs, etc., that you might want to include. Again, if they ask for it, give it to them. If they let you give it to them, keep it to a minimum, but give it to them. If they don't ask for it, don't give it to them. Remember, the person reading your grant application has 30 minutes to read your grant application. You want to make sure that they have what they need and nothing more. Don't give me a flowery thing. Don't tell me that awesome, like if it's great and it shows your organization in great light, that's wonderful. Make sure it's on your website, because if somebody's really interested in what you're doing, they may go check out your website, but make sure that it makes sense for your grant application. So effective grant proposals align your sponsor's interests with your organization's interests. And that means that your vision and your mission matches what the organization is funding, that you're meeting all of their grant requirements, that the costs you are proposing for your grant are reasonable, that you're a credible organization. Remember when we started, when we talked about you have to have your 501c3, and that's really important for granting organizations. You have to prove that you are a real entity and that you are capable of doing what you do. And that's why I said sometimes those little grant applications are worth the effort, because it builds your credibility as an organization. That you are addressing a compelling problem and that your approach to that problem is unique or capable of handling that problem, that your staff is qualified. And if you're a staff of one, which I have worked in that situation, make sure that any volunteers that are working with your organization are also qualified. Make sure that the benefits of what you're proposing to do are clearly spelled out for the people who are receiving your services, for your community, and for the funder, and make sure that what you're proposing is sustainable. Okay, my last slide. What if I need more help? If you're thinking of hiring a freelance grant writer, one, know what it is that you want them to accomplish and review those expectations up front. I have done some freelance grant writing. No, I'm not currently taking on freelance grant writing. I'm in a PhD program and barely have time to think. But several times I've been approached about freelance grant writing, and the person just knows that they want a grant. They don't know what they want that grant for. Or they know they want that grant to fund this project, but they don't know what that actually is going to look like. They don't know what they're going to be using for that grant for. That doesn't work. And remember, if you're paying a freelance grant writer, you're usually paying them either by the hour or by the project. Don't waste your time and money. Don't waste their time and money. And that means be prepared. You have to provide details about your program, about your project that you're proposing, and your budget. And this is where I've often seen people want to hire a freelance grant writer because they don't have money. And so they don't have money. They think their grant writer is going to write them a grant and get them all this money. And the reason they don't have money is because their financial books are not in order. If your budget doesn't make sense, if your budget is not balanced, if you have checks sitting in a drawer somewhere that still need to be entered into QuickBooks, get yourself some help doing accounting, more so than getting a grant writer, because that's what's really going to help your organization. And then get yourself some individual donors, because grant writing is not the magic bullet. It takes time to write a grant. It takes time to receive a grant if you receive the grant. And even after you've received the grant, it takes time to get the money and cash it, et cetera, et cetera. So keep that in mind. And then finally, I want to make this very clear. Grant writers cannot be paid out of the grants that they are writing for you. One, it's against the American Grant Writers Association Code of Ethics, which I linked there for you. It's often not allowed by grant sponsors. Either they don't pay for salaries, or they'll explicitly say you can't pay your grant writer out of this. And it's also unfair to your grant writer. If somebody approaches me and says, hey, can you get paid out of this grant? And I know that out of every 5 grants I write, I might get 1 funded, maybe, then you're asking me to work for free for those other 4. And that's definitely not fair to your grant writer. So if you can't afford to pay for help, what can you do? Well, you can talk to your board members and see if somebody there has the capacity, the desire, the skill, the talent to write the grant, or a volunteer. Or you could see about getting an intern. I prefer that interns be paid at least a nominal amount. Unpaid labor is really unfair to a lot of lower income and minority people. And so asking an intern to work for free, unless you are giving college credit, is really unfair. So that's my little spiel there on that. Do recommend paying interns at least a stipend or something that out of your finances, not the budget. The problem with getting unpaid help or farming out help for your grant writing is that then you still have to come back, give them all the information that they need to write that grant, and you need to still go back and reread that grant to make sure that it's consistent internally. But there's no reason why, if you have a board member who's an accountant, you can't say, hey, can you help draft this budget for me for this grant? Because that's what they do, and they probably could do it in 30 minutes. And then that saved you 4 days of pounding your head against the desk saying, why doesn't Excel work for me? So, do use your resources in that way, but do know that you then also need to come back and reread it and make sure that it all makes sense and it all flows through. All right. So now, if anyone has any questions.
Great, go ahead and unmute yourself if you have any questions, or if you would like to drop them in the chat, I can ask the questions. I'll check out the chat right now. While we're waiting, because I don't see anyone unmute themselves yet. I have a question. So, when it comes to annual reports, is that something, and you may have covered this and I didn't catch it. Is that something you automatically include? Like you need to you need to have a budget and you need to include your annual report, or is that something that you wait for them to say, include that?
What do you mean an annual report?
Like if I had a nice little, like there's some organizations that have like little booklets that are just so easy to read, like that kind of annual report.
Uh-uh.
Okay.
I wouldn't include that unless they're saying you can add supplemental materials or they're asking for it.
Okay.
Because I don't have time to read about your entire organization. Usually an annual report is your entire organization's financial background and what they have accomplished and things like that. And that's great. And that's good that you know that. But they're looking at information specific to the program that they're going to be funding. So now if they're giving money for operating expenses, then they may ask for an annual report. But most of the time you're not going to see that. And like I said, do not include it if they're not asking for it.
Perfect. Okay, that answered my question. Thank you. And we have a question in the chat. Kim asks, back on the part about the title, you said something about putting the title at the end. I think what you may have said was you may wait until the end to have your title. Can you please review what you said about the title?
Yes. So your title doesn't go at the end. It goes at the beginning, obviously. But oftentimes I work backwards in my grant applications. So I will start with my budget. And then I start with the narrative, and I'll do the intro to my organization, and then I'll do my title, and then my abstract. And the reason for that is that as you're writing all those things, your title may clarify, because let's say you're not doing a Summer Camp 2013 title. Let's say you're trying to do something a little more catchy. As you're writing your narrative, you might come across that line that's like, that's what's going to get people's attention. That's the line I need as my title. So if you've already got a title, then you might be like, I'm going to add it as a colon, or no, like leave your, or of course, now if the granting organization is saying you need to have this number and this thing, and then you say your name, then you're going to do that and you don't have to worry about that. But if you're getting to choose your own title and you've got the time to work on that, then I would do it towards the end of your writing process, but it is at the beginning. And what you're finding now is that most of the time, any organization that's a bigger organization, and it doesn't have to be huge, but any organization that's kind of with the times is going to do an online portal for your application. And so that is going to be something that is just automatically, that's the first blank is your title. So so that's not really available. If it's a Word document and you're filling it out kind of thing, then yeah, it should still be at the beginning.
Awesome. Okay. Elizabeth asks, if an organization is exploring contracting with a grant writer, how are their fees normally calculated?
It depends on each grant writer. Some people charge by the hour. Some people charge by the project. Some grant writers, what they'll do is they'll actually build you like a little bundle, and they'll say, okay, we'll write you 5 grants and give you some templates you can use for future grant writing for X amount of dollars. So it really depends on the grant writers. There are some standards based on the American Grant Writers Association, and also just what the market will bear in your area. So what you need to do is you need to contact your grant writer and say, what are your rates and what do you charge? Grant writers are they're not out to get, you know, nonprofits in the wallet, but they do need to get paid, and they do need to make their money. So yeah, it's individual to each person and to where they are. There aren't very many here, as I understand, in the Alabama area. But you don't necessarily need a local grant writer. There are people who work remotely. When I worked for an organization in Florida when I lived in Colorado, and I just did that remotely. If you hire somebody remotely, it's even more important that you really have your information ready to go to send them, because if there's a time lag at all or anything like that, then you're really wasting time and money if they're having to wait to get an email answered.
That's great. Thank you so much. All right. Kim asks, is there a rule of thumb or best practice about going back to a foundation after they have funded? For example, waiting X number of years if they have made a substantial gift. Also, what percentage of grant applications are funded as a rule?
So these are actually both really great questions to ask the program officer when you call, because they're really insightful questions and they're not something you're necessarily going to find on their website, except you might. So for reapplying to a foundation, if they funded you and they don't say you can't come again, then there's no reason you can't reapply. Just make sure that you're putting together a really reasonable grant application. So the Arts Council, for example, they funded us every year, and they had no problem doing that because that's what they're set up to do. They are set up to help organizations who do need continual support for different projects. I had to make sure that my project made sense and that it was expanding and growing, but I could reapply to them. Whereas if I applied to there was a community foundation in North Alabama that I applied to and got some funding, and I could apply for 3 years in a row, and then I had to sit out a year. And then I could apply again. And that was very clearly on their website, and that's something that I did. And then as far as like the percentage that they are funding, that is up to each organization as well. It usually varies based, like for the Arts Council, based on appropriations by the state. For the Junior League, how much money they fundraised that year. So that percentage will vary by organization and probably by year, but there's no reason why you can't ask them that. Say, hey, what percentage? The Arts Council is actually very good about telling you what percentage of organizations are generally funded and how much of your grant application is funded. So this is something I didn't mention, but you should probably keep in mind. When you're working on your budget, if you need $10,000 to do this project, and you can reasonably write your budget to actually be 15 or even 20, then do it, because most granting organizations are not going to be able to fund everybody at 100%. And so like the Arts Council, when they put out their RFPs, the request for proposal, they will often say, we can fund people at 75% of requests. So that means that even if you write the best grant application they have ever seen, all they're going to be able to offer you is 75% of the money that you asked for. So if you have a reasonable budget that you can say, well, we need 15 when you know you need 10, then you put yourself in a situation where then you can actually still do your project, even if you get fully funded, but fully funding isn't the full amount you requested. Or sometimes a grant organization will say, yes, we're fully funding you, except we're taking out these line items because they don't fit what we actually will fund. Or we decided actually in order to fund more people, we're not funding X, Y, or Z. Then they'll do that. Then keep that in mind when you're writing that.
Perfect. And one last question. As a grant writer for an organization, can you expect, what can you expect for funding for 1 of 10 applications or 1 in 5? Is there national average?
I have not come across that number in my research. I think it has to do a lot with how compelling your story is and how much competition there is in your area. And there's so many factors involved in that. And so if you're a grant writer for an organization and your boss is saying, well, you need to have like deliverables and I need to see, then your deliverables need to be, I am applying for a grant once a month, or I am, finding X number of grants to apply for. Your deliverables cannot necessarily be, I'm going to land X number of funds or X number of dollars, because that's not up to you. And even if you write 100 grant applications, you may not get funded for any of them if there's some barrier that's keeping you out of place. I know there's one organization that's very dear to my heart, but they're geographically located outside of many granting organizations areas. And so they have a really great mission, and they are the only ones doing what they're doing, and there's obviously a need for what they're offering. But a lot of these granting organizations are like, we love what you're doing, but we can't actually fund you because you're not in our area. But where that area is, there's not other organizations that are funding. So that organization is still writing grant applications because maybe one day somebody will be like, yes, actually, we're going to bend the rules and do this. But actually for that organization, what I would tell them is they need to start meeting people who are, they need to start meeting people who are in,
been there recently.
Sorry guys, that's my they need to start meeting people who are working for funders, and who there's 2 of them who are working for funders, and and building connections with individuals who then may be able to sway the granting organization to say, you know what, I know these people, I know this is outside of our geographic area, but this is really an organization that's worth supporting. Let's bend the rules. And that's not going to work with a national organization that's raising funds. That's going to be a small local funder who's like, you know what, I really like you. Let's make this happen. Oh yeah, it's working from home has been almost impossible. And yeah, it's fun.
That was awesome. Thank you. You did a great job. Hi, explaining that. All right, so I think if anyone else has any more questions, be sure to email to me. I'll go ahead and go ahead with our closing remarks. Thanks again for joining us today to learn more about grant writing. Please join me in thanking Noemí for preparing for and presenting today. And if you have any additional questions or comments, feel free to email me at branyba@auburn.edu, though you will get an email from me later and you can just reply to that. Please join us next Wednesday, June 22nd at 10 a.m. as Auburn University's digital philanthropy strategist, Ryan King, presents an online giving Q&A. To register, which it's always free, and to make sure you send in your questions, email me. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to see all of you, and thank you so much, Noemí.
Thank you.
We'll talk to y'all later. Bye.